In 1955, a man walked into an apartment in San Francisco. He had been invited by a woman he'd met at a bar nearby. She was charming. The apartment was nicer than he expected, a sprawling duplex on Chestnut Street in the North Beach neighborhood, with sweeping views of the bay. The walls were decorated with prints by Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. There were flowers. There was music. There was a drink waiting for him on the table. He drank it. What happened next, he could not have prepared for. The walls began to breathe. The room stretched and contracted. Time became elastic. Minutes felt like hours, hours like minutes. Colors bled into each other. Sounds arrived from directions that didn't exist. He became convinced at some point that he was dying. He was not dying. He had been dosed with lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, without his knowledge, without his consent, and without any warning of what was about to happen to him. And behind a mirror on the wall of that apartment, a man sat on a portable toilet, sipping a martini and watching every second of it, taking notes, laughing. That man was George Hunter White, federal narcotics agent, CIA operative, World War II veteran, and by his own description, written in a letter he sent to his supervisor after he retired, one of the happiest men alive. Because this, as far as George Hunter White was concerned, was the greatest job in the history of American government. I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, he wrote. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and the blessing of the All-Highest? Those are his words, preserved in the historical record, written by a man who believed, with apparent sincerity, that what he was doing was not only permitted, but necessary, that the United States government had given him permission to do whatever was required to win the Cold War, and that whatever was required happened to include this. What you are about to hear is the story of Operation Midnight Climax, a CIA program so secret that even most senior government officials had no idea it existed. A program that ran for more than a decade, across multiple cities, funded by American taxpayer dollars, authorized at the highest levels of the Central Intelligence Agency. A program whose entire purpose was to find out what LSD could do to a person who didn't know they were taking it, and whose methods were exactly as dark as that sounds. If you watched our first video on MKUltra, the CIA's 20-year program of illegal human experimentation, you already know the broader picture. Operation Midnight Climax was a sub-project of MKUltra, the most notorious one. The one that, when it was finally exposed in the late 1970s, made Senate investigators sit back in their chairs and go quiet for a moment before asking their next question. This is its story. And it begins, as so many of the worst things in American history begin, with a man who was very good at his job. George Hunter White was born in 1908 in California. By the time he was 30, he was already a legend in federal law enforcement. He had helped capture Lucky Luciano, at the time, the most powerful organized crime figure in the United States. He had broken up heroin and opium rings across Europe, the Middle East, Latin America, and Asia. He was fearless, aggressive, and utterly convinced that the ends justified any means necessary. He was also, by multiple accounts, a man who genuinely enjoyed the parts of the job that most people found disturbing. When Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA's chief chemist and the man behind MKUltra, was looking for someone to run a new kind of operation in 1953, White was exactly what he needed. Not a scientist, not a bureaucrat, not someone who would ask too many questions about ethics or oversight, someone who would get the job done and enjoy every minute of it. Stay with me. It started in New York, not San Francisco. In the fall of 1953, George Hunter White set up the first CIA safe house in an apartment at 81 Bedford Street in Greenwich Village. He decorated it himself, not with the Toulouse-Lautrec prints that would come later, but with the kind of bohemian clutter that would attract a certain kind of visitor in 1950s New York. He gave himself a cover identity, Morgan Hall, a struggling artist. From the fall of 1953 through the spring of 1954, White threw parties at Bedford Street. He dosed his guests with sodium pentothal, Nembutal, and LSD. He observed them from a hidden position. He filed reports with Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA's technical services staff. Then Frank Olson fell from a hotel window. If you watched our MKUltra video, you know the story. Olson was a CIA-connected scientist who had been secretly dosed with LSD at a company retreat and subsequently suffered a catastrophic psychological breakdown. His death, which the CIA ruled a suicide, and which Olson's family has spent decades arguing was something else, created a crisis. People were asking questions. The New York operation felt suddenly exposed. White moved to San Francisco, and in San Francisco the operation found its final form. The apartment at 225 Chestnut Street was, by any measure, a remarkable place. It was a sprawling 6-bedroom duplex in the Telegraph Hill neighborhood, with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the San Francisco Bay. White decorated it with specific intent, Toulouse-Lautrec prints on the walls, large mirrors positioned strategically throughout the rooms, and in what would later be described as one of the more surreal details of the entire MKUltra program, photographs of women in bondage and provocative posters designed to create a particular atmosphere. The mirrors were not decorative. Behind them was an observation room, equipped with recording devices, some disguised as electrical outlets, a chair, a desk, a small portable refrigerator stocked with martini ingredients, and a portable toilet, installed specifically so that the man behind the glass would not have to leave his position to attend to basic functions. George Hunter White was not going to miss anything. The operation worked like this. Women, paid by the CIA at a rate of $100 per night, were recruited to work out of the apartment. They were given a simple instruction: bring men back. Clients, strangers. Men they met at bars in North Beach, in the Tenderloin, along the waterfront. Men visiting San Francisco for business. Men who simply happened to be in the wrong place on the wrong night. Once the men were inside, their drinks were spiked. With LSD primarily, sometimes with other psychotropic substances, psilocybin, mescaline, combinations that the CIA's chemists were still evaluating. The women had been trained in what the CIA called post-coital questioning, techniques for extracting information from a subject in the vulnerable period immediately following sexual activity. White had installed a miniature refrigerator in the observation room. He would arrive for a session with a fresh supply of gin and vermouth, mix his martinis behind the glass, and spend the evening watching. One of his colleagues at the Federal Bureau of Narcotics described White in terms that capture something essential about the operation. He was a son of a bitch, but he was a great cop. There were 2 other Bay Area locations connected to the operation. Room 49 of the Plantation Inn at Lombard and Webster Streets, and a location at 261 Green Street in Mill Valley. The CIA was thorough. A second safe house was later established in New York City, in Greenwich Village, and run on the same model. For nearly a decade, this system operated. Men walked into CIA apartments thinking they were spending a private evening with a woman they'd met, and walked out, hours later, deeply confused, sometimes terrified, sometimes incapacitated, having been subjected to a government experiment they would never know had happened to them. Some of them didn't walk out at all. Some had to be managed, talked down, sedated, physically restrained, because the combination of LSD and the circumstances produced reactions that the agents behind the mirror had not anticipated and could not control. White's own interest had, by many accounts, evolved considerably from the original scientific mandate. His diary entries and the testimony of people who worked with him suggest that the observation sessions had become something much less clinical. White's diary describes dosing people at a beach, at a bar, in a restaurant, strangers who had no connection to the safe house, no interaction with the women, no reason to suspect that their coffee or their cocktail had been tampered with. Randomly. Because he could. Because Gottlieb had given him permission to test on anyone. Because it was fun. The official justification for Operation Midnight Climax was mind control research. The CIA wanted to know if LSD could be weaponized, used on enemy agents, foreign leaders, Soviet interrogators. But as the operation continued, the goals shifted. Or rather, they expanded. A declassified memo uncovered by psychiatrist Colin Ross, who spent years reviewing surviving CIA documents, revealed a secondary purpose that had been there from the beginning and that became increasingly central as the program developed. The CIA was testing the women, not just using them as instruments to dose the men, testing them, evaluating whether women who worked as prostitutes could be trained and deployed as intelligence assets, as field agents who could seduce, extract information, and compromise targets. The safe houses were, in part, a training and assessment program for potential female spies. The women were observed just as the men were. Their techniques were analyzed. Their ability to remain calm under pressure, to execute the post-coital questioning protocols, to manage a subject who was experiencing a severe psychological reaction. All of it was documented, reported, evaluated. They were not told this was happening either. Agency analysts began asking systematic questions. How should the women be trained? How should they handle exposure to classified information? At what precise moment in a sexual encounter was a target most vulnerable to information extraction? They reached a conclusion, documented in CIA files. The optimal moment, they determined, was immediately after sex. This was the CIA. This was the United States government. These were the questions they were spending taxpayer money to answer. There is a document, one of the few that survived the 1973 destruction order, that shows receipts signed by a CIA employee for $2,000 in $100 bills distributed to persons involved in Operation Midnight Climax. The money trail is thin, by design, but it is there. The subjects of those payments were never identified. The men who were dosed in those apartments were never named. The women who worked in them were never publicly identified. Most of them are gone now, and the record of what was done to them was fed through a shredder in January 1973 on the orders of CIA Director Richard Helms. What we know is a fragment, a fraction of what was there, and what we know is already this disturbing. In the accounts of Operation Midnight Climax that survived the destruction of the files, the victims appear almost entirely without names. There is, in one widely cited account, a middle-aged businessman visiting San Francisco for a conference. He accepted an invitation to an apartment in North Beach. He drank what he was offered. He experienced over the following hours something he could not explain or name: intense paranoia, visual distortions, the absolute conviction that something was catastrophically wrong. He had no framework for understanding it. LSD was not a known substance to the general public in 1955. He went back to his hotel. He went home. He went back to his life. He almost certainly never knew what had happened to him. White's diary describes dosing people at a beach, at a bar, in a restaurant. Strangers who had no connection to any CIA program, who were simply present in the wrong place when George Hunter White decided to expand his research into the general population of San Francisco. Some of those people reacted badly. Some, according to the documents, committed crimes while under the influence, armed robberies, assaults. The CIA internal memo that described these incidents noted, without apparent concern, that the perpetrators had been prosecuted and punished as if they had not been under the influence of CIA-administered substances. Read that again. The CIA dosed people with LSD without their knowledge. Some of those people, in the grip of a substance they didn't know they had taken, committed crimes. And the CIA watched those people get arrested and convicted, and said nothing. The experiment was more important than the lives it touched. When the Church Committee, the Senate investigation into illegal intelligence activities, began examining MKUltra and its sub-projects in 1975, Senator Frank Church described what he found in language that was unusual for a man who had spent his career in the measured speech of politics. He called it a rogue elephant. The CIA, he said, had operated as a rogue elephant, beyond any oversight, beyond any accountability, beyond any constraint that the American system of government was supposed to impose on its own agencies. Operation Midnight Climax was the clearest expression of that. In 1962, CIA Inspector General John Ehrman submitted a report. He had been reviewing the safe house operations. What he found disturbed him enough to put it in writing. He strongly recommended closing the facilities. The experiments, he wrote, lacked scientific value. The methods were indefensible. The exposure risk was unacceptably high. The safe houses were scaled back in 1963. The San Francisco locations were officially closed in 1965. The New York operation followed in 1966. It had run for more than a decade. George Hunter White retired from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1966. He moved to Stinson Beach, north of San Francisco. He was awarded the Bureau's highest honor upon his retirement. He died in October 1975, months after the Church Committee began its investigation, but before the full extent of his work became public knowledge. He died without facing any charges, without being publicly named in connection with Operation Midnight Climax, without ever being asked, under oath, to account for what he had done. Sidney Gottlieb, who had authorized the entire program, testified before the Senate in closed session in 1977 under a pseudonym. He was never charged. The women who had worked in the safe houses were never publicly identified. The men who had been dosed were never notified. There was no list. The list had been shredded. There were no trials, no convictions, no official apologies to the victims. The apartment itself still stands. The duplex at 225 Chestnut Street sold in 2015 for more than $10 million. It has been renovated many times. The one-way mirrors are gone. The observation room is gone. Most of the people who live in that neighborhood have no idea what happened there. George Hunter White wrote one more thing in that letter to his former boss. After the line about lying and killing and stealing with the blessing of the All-Highest, he added something that has stayed with historians who study this period. He wrote that he had been a very minor missionary, a heretic, he called himself, but one who toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards. The word that stays with me is missionary, because a missionary believes he is doing God's work. A missionary believes that the people he is converting, or in White's case, drugging, are being served by what is happening to them, even if they don't know it, even if they didn't ask for it, even if it destroys something in them that cannot be repaired. That was how George Hunter White understood Operation Midnight Climax. He was serving his country, protecting the free world, advancing the science of human behavior, doing what needed to be done, and having fun while he did it. The Cold War is over. Sidney Gottlieb is dead. George Hunter White is dead. The apartment on Chestnut Street has been renovated beyond recognition. But the question Operation Midnight Climax raises has not gone away. How much do we not know? How many programs like this, programs with names that haven't been declassified, programs whose files were not accidentally misfiled, are still buried? We will probably never know. What we can do is know this much. Remember these names. Understand what was done and who did it, and what they said about it afterward. Because the best protection against this kind of thing is people who know what happened. If this story matters to you, share it. Because most people have never heard of Operation Midnight Climax. Most people don't know this happened in an apartment you can look up on Google Maps, in a city that still exists, 60 years ago. Next week we're covering the Tuskegee syphilis study. 40 years, 400 men, and a government that watched them die and called it science. Subscribe if you don't want to miss it. I'll see you in the next one.